Hi, everyone. I'm Stephanie. I am an advisor in the Study Abroad office, and I'm here with my colleague Maura, who's the coordinator in the office. And today we're going to provide you with a broad overview on the topic of cultural adjustment and self-care, because we believe that your mental health while you're abroad is just as important as your physical health. And so we're also going to share a bunch of resources with you. So feel free to pause this video at any time to take notes and explore some of the resources that we mentioned. Let's go ahead and get started.
So I'd like for you to take a moment just to think about what culture means to you. What exactly is culture and what do you associate with culture? And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
All right. And so Geert Hofstede, who is a Dutch or was a Dutch social psychologist, has this one definition. There are a lot of different definitions of culture, but he said that culture is the collective programming of the human mind that distinguishes the members of one human group from another. Culture, in this sense, is a system of collectively held values. So he thinks culture comes down to values, and it's kind of the way that people from different backgrounds perceive things differently. So kind of keep that in mind as like a background to this discussion.
So culture is a neutral term. It's not good, it's not bad. And it is, as Stephanie mentioned, a collective historical patterns and mostly what we see as values and what we grow up with. A lot of culture is perceivable, observable to the naked eye, and you can hear it, you can see it, you can feel it. And so often culture is compared to an iceberg. Just like an iceberg has a visible section above the waterline and a larger invisible section below the waterline, culture is quite similar in that, excuse me, there are aspects that are observable that can only be, that can be seen. Those things like language, dress, food, music, things that you can experience with your senses. And then below the surface are things that you can't really see as easily and can't easily understand if you're not a part of that culture. Those are things more like belief systems, norms, habits. You can see some of the examples in the iceberg here. The further down you go, the less likely it is that for us to necessarily perceive it as culture. Down to how we feel about elders and dependents, the concept of self, past and future, things like that. And so a couple of examples that I like to talk about are the concept of friendship, how easy it is to make friends in a given culture, personal space, how big is your personal space bubble? That does vary drastically between some cultures. And in some of the countries that you may be going to visit, you might notice that, especially on public transportation. And then eye contact, whether or not direct eye contact is considered impolite or threatening. So we will talk a little bit more about these different dimensions of culture and what they might look like where you go. But it's important to remember that there's more to culture than what you can actually see and experience. And so it's good to keep an open mind.
And so we're going to kind of use a few proverbs to demonstrate some of the cultural dimensions that Hofstede, the same guy who gave us that definition of culture, identified to kind of compare different cultures. But before I start that, I just want to mention the difference between stereotypes and generalizations. So stereotypes are like, I mean, I think we all basically know, but they're kind of conceptions about people from a specific group or culture that don't change with new information and might not necessarily be based in reality. whereas generalizations kind of give us a starting point from which to learn about other cultures and continue learning. And once we get new information, we can change those. So all of these things that we're going to talk about are generalizations. So we know that not everybody in every culture fits into these ideas, but it's just kind of helpful to have like a basis so that you're not like totally confused and surprised when you start interacting with people from a different culture. So with that lens, this first proverb is from Japan, and it says, "The nail that sticks up gets hammered down." So usually if we were in person, I would then ask everybody what they thought this kind of meant within Japanese culture. But since we're not, I'll just tell you. So this kind of means that people who stick out from the norm will be like hammered back into place because they value cooperation and not drawing attention to yourself as an individual. And so Maura is going to kind of get deeper into that.
So one of the cultural dimensions that is used to explain this is referred to as individualism versus collectivism. So individualism can be defined as a preference for a loosely knit social framework in which individuals are expected to take care of only themselves and their immediate families. You'll notice on this graph that the United States is pretty high in individualism. That might not be surprising. And the opposite is collectivism, which represents a preference for a tightly knit framework in which individuals can expect that their relatives or the group members will look after them in exchange for unquestioning loyalty. So it's kind of comes down to whether or not the concept of self-image is defined in terms of I or we. Personally, I lived in Japan for about 5 years in total growing up. And I experienced this as an English teacher in Japan, where I expected when I gave an assignment or asked a question to one student that just that one student would be answering it. But really almost everything ended up being a group effort. And I find that like group work is definitely a lot more popular there, and people are more comfortable with group work in that culture than they would be necessarily here. Thinking back to the last time you had a group project, you might be able to identify with that. But it does come down to how people view themselves and view collaboration.
All right, and so the next one is the eyes cannot rise above the eyebrow. And so this one kind of alludes to the fact that, in some of the Middle Eastern countries, they take hierarchy very seriously. And so they, respect for elders and people in positions of power is very important. So Maura is going to, again, talk a little bit more about that dimension.
The cultural dimension that we would use to explain this, or at least to provide theory to it, is called power distance. So power distance expresses the degree to which the less powerful members in a society accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So it depends on how a society or a culture handles inequalities among people. So if you have a large degree of power distance, you would tend to accept a hierarchical order in which everyone has a place, and that needs no further justification. And if you have a low power distance, people would strive to equalize the distribution of power and demand justification for inequalities of power. And Stephanie, I think you had an example from personal experience with this one.
Yes, so I studied abroad in Senegal in West Africa, and they definitely have higher power distance than the US. And so one example is that my host father would eat like at a normal table by himself for dinner every day, whereas the rest of the family would eat like on these stools and like share share a dish together. And so at first they had, you know, had me sitting with my host father for all of the meals because I was a guest. And then I asked, like, you know, to sit with the rest of the family. But that was definitely something that I was caught off guard by when I first got there. All right, and the last proverb we have is an American one, so you might recognize it. And it is, the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so kind of took this one as people who like speak up and are direct or act out are the ones who get the attention. And so again, Maura's going to explain this one more.
And so the theory that we use to explain this is high context versus low context communication. So low context communication is explicit with little left to inference. So you don't need as much context to understand what the person is trying to say. So the addressee is likely to understand all the information, even if they're unfamiliar with the context. Whereas in high context communication, a great deal of information is implied rather than stated directly. So you do need to have a deep understanding of the cultural context to understand what's being said. There's a pretty low context phrase that you might be familiar with, and that is just say what you mean and mean what you say. And that is definitely indicative of someone who's coming from a low context communication culture, like the United States happens to be one, and you would also maybe refer to it as very direct. I experienced this in Japan as well, because cultures that are high context also tend to be collectivist, because high context communication is only really possible when you have a deep knowledge of one another, and that tends to be of one another and of the culture and have close connections over a long period of time. And so that tends to be more common in a collectivist society. And so I experienced this in Japan where, say if somebody came in wearing like a short sleeve shirt and it was just a little bit too short sleeves, because I think the shoulders are a little bit more, wearing bare shoulders is a bigger deal there, I think, in a more formal setting than it is here. So if you came to work, say with a tank top or a short sleeve shirt, somebody wouldn't necessarily come up to you and say, you need to change, it's inappropriate, or that's not really appropriate for work, you should wear longer sleeves next time. They might say, oh, aren't you cold? And if you are part of that culture, it's pretty obvious. And you also start to pick up on those cues that maybe what they're not actually saying is, aren't you cold? Because the answer for us might have been, no, I'm fine. And it's probably like 90 degrees outside, and that's why you're wearing a tank top. But eventually you start to pick up on cues, and you need to learn that what people are saying is not actually what they mean, versus with the low context culture, it's the opposite.
Yeah, and so this is just, again, a continuum of high context versus low context. So you can see that the US is, you know, definitely on the low context side. So we're more direct in our communication than most countries. And we also have a link. I don't know if we can look at it now or we can just provide it for you later, so that you can, okay, yeah. And so you can compare the United States with whatever country you're traveling to look at, you know, some of the different cultural dimensions. So yeah, I think if you just type in the US, it'll compare them. Yep. So you can look, there are, yeah, 6 different cultural dimensions, and you can read more about them and kind of understand the differences, so that you can, yeah, kind of be prepared for some of the cultural differences you'll encounter.
So everyone does experience some degree of cultural adjustment or culture shock. When entering a new culture, it is normal to experience something It's not a sign that you are doing study abroad wrong or that you weren't prepared enough, that you failed at study abroad. It's just a sign that you're interacting with the host culture. You can experience it in just the same way when you're returning home. You may experience cultural adjustment in a different way than another person, and you may only get maybe some of the aspects of it. You may just have excitement and honeymoon phase the whole time that you're abroad. It depends on where you're going, how long you're there, how different the culture is from your home culture, what you're used to. And just your period in life. It tends to be different for me every time that I go abroad. We will talk a little bit more about the range of cultural adjustment. Just to know that you can expect something, just know that things might feel a little bit different, and it's not necessarily positive or negative. I'll let Stephanie talk a little bit more about the spectrum.
Yeah, so cultural adjustment is a spectrum, like Maura said. Some people will experience it more intensely than others. Everyone's going to have a unique experience. So you might experience all of these things at different times. You might not get the shock part. You might, feel definite shock at some point, but just kind of be prepared for whatever you experience. Just know that it's normal and part of the cultural adjustment process.
So I'm going to show you this graph that you might see pretty often when people talk about culture shock or cultural adjustment. Just know that your graph might look totally different, and you might have a flat line. You might have what looks like an EKG or like a mountain. It is different for every person, and so kind of take that into account. And I'll try and compare some of these points to personal experiences that I had when I was abroad. I mentioned before that I lived in Japan. I lived there for 3 years in high school on a military base, and then 2 years after undergrad teaching English in the countryside. So these experiences, there was definitely very different each time, but I'll probably mostly talk about the second experience because I felt like I had more of an immersion in the host culture at that point. So at first you may experience what is known as the honeymoon phase. Everything is new, everything is exciting. You might not notice little things, little differences. You might notice them and just think that they're amazing. Some people never leave this phase, and that's great. I was not one of those people. I tend to experience anxiety like on a normal day. I also was homesick. I missed my dog. This happened both times that I traveled abroad. It's usually my dog that causes the issues. So you may go towards from the honeymoon to a crisis phase or an adjustment phase. Crisis sounds really dramatic. I understand that. But for me, this was mostly characterized by a stage of frustration. I was cranky. I was irritated by little things, differences in the culture that I started to notice. And I took it personally. But that was really just a symptom of my personal adjustment to the culture in Japan. And also just sometimes it has to do with the seasons. For me, it was really cold and not as many people wanted to go hang out. And so it was lonelier. And so I was a little bit depressed. And I was there for a long period of time. So obviously it was different for me, but, and even having lived in Japan before, I felt more cultural adjustment, culture shock than I thought that I would. So after I was over being irritated and I started to work my way through the cultural adjustment, I began to adapt to this new specific culture in Japan that I was becoming a part of. And that's adaptation and resolution. And eventually started to feel like I was a part of the culture, like I had my own specific place there, and really appreciated the new home and the new family and friends that I had there. At that point, by the time that I was ready to leave, I was excited about returning home, but also obviously sad to leave this new experience that I had created for myself. But I experienced the same symptoms when I went back home. I had reverse culture shock, cultural adjustment. I had another low where I just felt really frustrated that nobody could understand what I had gone through when I was in Japan. And this 2 year, really 5 years of my life, I had to just summarize in a couple of words, and people don't really want to talk about Japan all the time. And so I was just a little frustrated, annoyed. I couldn't relate. I guess I couldn't find people that related. But once I did find people who had had similar experiences and found ways to apply those experiences to my life back home, to the graduate degree that I was now working on, I started to readjust and started to really feel like, wow, like I'm so glad that I had that experience. And I don't think I necessarily, at least like personally for me, would have understood and appreciated everything that I had gained while I was in Japan and all the really amazing experiences that I'd had if I hadn't had that stage of frustration to reflect on afterward. There is a stage here, I think it could be considered stage 5 or stage 9, that you would call integration or reintegration, where you start to learn how to use those experiences in your new life. That's going to look different for every single person. Obviously, I work and study abroad, so that had something to do with my reintegration, but I think it does look different for every person. And there's another GIF. I forget sometimes that I put these in here. So, relatable.
Yeah, and I'll just talk about like one of my, or kind of frustrations or adjustments that like seems kind of silly, you wouldn't think about it, but when I did an internship in Italy, I had anxiety at first around just like going to stores. So like I had to go to the grocery store to get food, but I was like very nervous because my Italian was very basic at the time, and I didn't, they kind of had different things than what I'm used to. I wasn't sure how everything worked, and I didn't want to look stupid. And so it made me nervous to go. And for a while, even like my light bulb went out in my apartment, and I just didn't try and find a new light bulb for a while because I was too like anxious about it. But eventually I kind of got over those little fears. And I think it's good to like celebrate when you have those little victories, and kind of figure those things out. That's one of the, like, I feel like most important parts of studying abroad is kind of making those little adjustments. But yeah, so for preparing for dealing with cultural adjustment, kind of what we've talked about so far, doing some research about the country and its culture before you go is really helpful. And even, if you have time to like read more in depth, like I lived in Brazil for a while, and it was really helpful for me to like read some books about the history there to like put everything in context and understand the culture better. You probably won't necessarily have time to do that much, but maybe, your own version. While you're there, make sure that you keep an open mind and remember that different is not wrong, and normal is relative. So you might see some things that you think are really strange and abnormal, but remember, like, people in that country are raised to think differently than you. So just kind of try and think of things from their perspective. Journaling is also helpful to kind of process all the differences that you're seeing. And it's also really fun to look back at the journals that you wrote while you were abroad. It's a really good way to kind of remember how you were feeling at that point and remember all the experiences you had. Embarking on solo adventures could be better for some people than others. I've tried that before. I'm not really a huge fan, but for some people it's great, and a good way to grow. So you might want to at least try it out if you feel comfortable. And yeah, finding a piece of home abroad can be helpful as well. So I know most places that I've gone, they don't really have peanut butter, and that tends to be a big thing that, like, for some reason, a lot of American students and a lot of my friends when I was abroad really missed peanut butter. And so, like, you might be able to find some kind of specialty store that sells peanut butter, and just having that might make you feel a little bit more at home. And yeah, also make sure that you're trying to kind of make connections with people where you are. So staying connected at home is important, but you want to make sure that you're not letting that get in the way of, like, having these new experiences and meeting people in your host country. And so joining a club is a really great way to do that. And there also usually, might be international student clubs that you can join, or some kind of like organization in the city that you're in for expats or something that you can join. But yeah, also make sure that you're taking care of yourself and paying attention to your mental health needs. So make sure that you're, getting some rest, getting enough sleep, and you can't necessarily do everything. So make sure that you're saying no to things if you're, too tired, or, it's good to get out of your comfort zone, but make sure you're taking care of yourself too.
So we want to talk a little bit about resilience, and that means basically just the process of adapting well in the face of adversity, trauma, tragedy, threats, or a significant source of stress. I think we're all very familiar with that right now because of what's been going on in the country and the world. So we'll talk a little bit about skills that you can practice to show resilience and foster resilience, and what that might look like when you're going abroad.
Yeah, so I'll just briefly go over these. So like I said, pay attention to your mental health needs and assert, yourself to make sure that you're keeping up with those and prioritizing your needs when possible. And recognize that your thoughts are valid, but also remember to take a step back and evaluate them. And, as I said, keep an open mind. And also another one is use deep breathing and mindfulness techniques to stay grounded and not get overwhelmed by your thoughts and anxieties. So we're going to play a quick guided breathing exercise for you to practice a little bit.
Mindful breathing. Close your eyes and rest your hands on your knees. Bring your attention to the touch of your body on your seat. Feel the weight of your body on your chair or cushion. Make sure that your back is straight and that you're comfortable. Take a few deep breaths. While you're breathing deeply, relax your shoulders, your stomach muscles, the muscles in your face, your hands, and your legs. Let go of all the tightness in your body. Now bring your attention back to your breath. Notice what it feels like as it enters through your nose, goes down through your throat, filling your lungs, and back out through your nose. Notice your stomach and chest rise and fall each time you breathe in and each time you breathe out. And just allow your breathing to be natural and relaxed. Now bring your attention to the feeling of your breath in your nose. Feel your breath as it comes in and goes out. Just focus on this sensation, paying attention to each time you breathe in and each time you breathe out. As you inhale, maybe your breath feels cool. And as you exhale, maybe it feels a little warmer. When your mind wanders, or if you become distracted, just notice what's going on in your head, and then gently bring your attention back to your breath, going in and out. Focus on the feeling of your breath and allow thoughts and feelings to come and go in the background. Now gently bring your attention back to the touch of your body on your seat and open your eyes.
And so, yeah, just to finish up with this slide, there are a lot of different breathing exercises and coping techniques that you can find to help with anxiety. So this is just one video. There's so many different techniques you can learn. So you can just do a quick Google or YouTube search and find a bunch, and then kind of choose one or two that work best for you and kind of have them as like tools for you to use when you need them. Yeah, so we can move on to the next slide.
Okay, so self-care, you've definitely heard of self-care before. Hopefully you're practicing it before you go abroad, but essentially we want to make sure that you are taking care of yourself while you go abroad, because stress tends to be heightened whether or not you are in a stressful phase of cultural adjustment. So have some compassion. As Stephanie mentioned before, it's kind of a big deal what you're doing, and I think will be tempted to say yes to everything, but you need to set boundaries for yourself and know when it's okay to say no, understand your own body and your own responses to stress, and know when you're seeing signs in yourself that maybe it's time to take a break and ease up and rest. Sleep is probably the most important thing on this list. And I have a feeling that you may or may not be getting enough sleep right now as a college student, just from personal experience. But when you're going abroad and you experience jet lag and you experience cultural adjustment and stress, and you're also tempted to take part in almost every experience that comes to you, you're probably not getting enough sleep. And almost all of the phases of cultural adjustment, all of the stress, the symptoms that you might experience are heightened when you don't have enough sleep. So it's important to try and prioritize at least trying to get 8 hours. That is what you should be getting on average. And that can make a big difference in all the other aspects of your experience while you're there. Obviously, you should be eating regular meals, even though sometimes that's not easy to do. I know Stephanie mentioned like the grocery store stress. That was my first place that I cried when I was in Japan, because they didn't have cheese. I couldn't find like the grocery ingredients I was used to. Sometimes I was feeling like so like anxious and shy about going somewhere and trying to speak Japanese that I would just skip a meal. And so you don't want to do that. It kind of goes along with sleep. If you're not eating enough, then things all feel a lot worse than they really are. So try and find out how you can get your ingredients, how you can cook, like where are the best places to do that, how can you do it with the equipment that you have. It might be different there, but also where can you go to get food that's the least amount of contact with another person if you're just feeling like you're not ready to talk to another person, you're not ready to practice the language. There are definitely places like that. For me, it was the convenience stores in Japan. If I just wanted to go real quick and get something to eat. Just make sure that you're prioritizing your health, socialize. Like I said, it's okay to say no, but it is important to have contacts both in the country that you're studying in and back home that understand what you're going through and they understand you. Exercise helps. Obviously, exercise creates endorphins. Endorphins make people happy. Talked about boundaries, safety, your physical safety. is one of those hierarchical needs that needs to be met before you can focus on the rest. So make sure that you're being careful, that you travel with a buddy when you know things aren't safe, and talk to the people at the host institution about where like the best places to travel are and where it's okay to travel alone versus with another person, and what you should do to be careful and be safe. And then share emotions and feelings. I know it sounds like kind of silly to say, but obviously if you let it bottle up, it's going to feel a lot worse. It does make everything else feel a lot more intense. So journal, talk to your friends and family, have somebody that you trust that you can kind of like let it all off onto, and you'll feel a lot better afterward.
Yeah, so speaking of sharing your feelings, as we talked about, seeking help is a form of self-care. And you don't need things to like get to this point, like we talk about here. You know, if your academic performance is suffering, and you're having a lot of changes in your mood and behavior from normal, or even like having substance abuse issues, and that can, you know, happen when students go abroad, or, you know, self-harm or suicidal thoughts. Definitely if those things are happening, then you'll want to seek help. But even if not, like if you're just kind of having trouble coping and you want to, you know, talk to somebody, you know, we have a bunch of resources that you can take advantage of.
So preparation is key, and knowing that there can be some stress factors associated with traveling during a pandemic, especially. A self-care plan helps you identify how you deal with stress so that you'll know how to identify how to handle situations abroad. So it's important to talk to your counselor or psychiatrist about your upcoming study abroad so that you can have a plan. And if you're already in counseling, excuse me, or on medication, you should develop a plan with your provider about what that's going to look like abroad. That's a really important thing. If you're not really sure, you can also talk to your study abroad advisor about where the first place to look would be. And consider signing a release of information between your counselor, psychiatrist, physician, and the study abroad office. That way, in case of an emergency, we can communicate with them about you. And yeah, create a self-care plan. That's kind of like looking at, what do I do typically when I'm feeling down? How do I know that I'm reaching a point where I need to reach out to somebody? How do I handle stress? What do I know is my self-care? Like a hot bath, like just taking some time to myself, saying no to social stuff, or just having a night in with one close friend. That's how that could possibly look like if you're feeling stressed.
Yeah, and so these are some of the resources that our counseling center offers. So you can look into kind of taking advantage of these things before or after you go abroad. But there are also drop-in groups and kind of group sessions that they have that you should be able to access while you're abroad as well. So you can kind of keep them in mind as a resource. And then Maura is going to talk about some of the resources, other resources that you can use while you're abroad.
So while you're studying abroad, there will be host institution resources or host third-party provider resources accessible to you, available to you. You can seek counseling in the community through your insurance, local counseling. You can also get telehealth counseling through GeoBlue. You'll be enrolled automatically, and that's a great option, especially if you wanted to communicate with somebody in the US rather than someone locally. It's good to confide in a travel buddy, like I mentioned before, somebody who gets it, understands what you're going through, and that you can trust. And then there are these 3 hotlines, essentially. You can call them anytime and always get in touch with somebody in case of an emergency. It's good to put these in your phone. and know how to dial them internationally when you go abroad. And if you get a new phone, make sure you put them in that phone while you're abroad. You can always contact somebody from our office at that second number there, which you may recognize as the campus police phone number. They do have our office's risk management team on the line. And so in case of an emergency, you don't need to calculate the time zone. You can call that number and we will be able to help.
All right. And lastly, we just have a few more resources for you. You can look back at these links. We did add one, the one at the top for coping with the with stress of the pandemic. And so, yeah, that is a different kind of stress than usual, definitely real. So that link might be helpful for you. And then others to just, again, make kind of self-care plans and just help kind of learn more about what you can do to prepare. But also, I just want to say that while all of these things are really important, and you might be experiencing some of these things, at different stages while you're abroad, we definitely both had this was only a part of our experience. So we had, or at least speaking for me, I loved my experiences and I gained so much from them. And so don't want to scare you for these things, but just making sure that you're aware of what might happen so you can understand it as you're going through it. Because when I went through these things, I didn't have the language or the concepts to kind of understand what was happening. And if I had, I think it would have been a lot easier to get through. So just wanted to add that.
Yeah, that's very true. We talk about some of the less pleasant aspects of going abroad, but that's just one small piece of the experience. And if it was so hard, I don't think we'd be sitting here talking to you about it and still encouraging you to go. And the experience of going through cultural adjustment is really how you experience cultural growth. I grew up a lot when I was in Japan and came back. You develop a lot of skills, and it's because you learn to adapt and to communicate with people through different cultural lens. And so we have our contact information here if you have any questions or if you just want to chat. Maybe you just want to hear from somebody who's been to Japan, or like Stephanie, who lived in a lot of different places and can tell you about her experience through that. We also have the Study Abroad office's email address here that you're probably familiar with by now, but you can always email there if you have a general question. And of course, you know that your Study Abroad advisor or the Prague office, if you're going to Prague, are the first point of contact for general questions about your program. But we're wishing you an amazing experience when you go abroad. Anything else, Stephanie?
Thank you.
Yeah.